There is a town in Texas that was wiped off the map so completely, twice, that its courthouse now sits underwater. There is a stretch of dirt road in the big thicket where a light shows up out of the black trees at night, close enough to stall your engine, and nobody in 120 years has managed to explain what it is. And there is a hill outside a sleepy river town where 17 men reached into a clay pot, pulled out a bean, and found out in that instant whether they would live or die. We are counting down 10 of them. Subscribe if you want Texas the way it actually happened, not the way the postcards tell it. Let's get into it. Number 10. Sour Lake. Sour Lake killed its own miracle and turned it into a fortune. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is just how it happened. Today, it's a quiet town of under 2,000 people off Highway 105, the kind of place you'd drive through without a second glance. But for almost 60 years, this was sacred ground. Long before any settler arrived, native tribes used the sulfurous mineral springs bubbling up from the earth here for healing. By 1850, there was a hotel standing over those springs, and the guest list eventually included Sam Houston himself, who came back more than once seeking relief for the wounds he carried from war. An ex-slave known locally as Dr. Mud built a reputation treating skin ailments with mud pulled straight from the lake bed. Newspapers as far away as El Paso and Washington, D.C. wrote about the healing waters. People traveled days by wagon just to sit in that mud. Then, in 1902, drillers noticed something. The same sulfur smell that made this place a health resort was also a signature of crude oil sitting underneath it. Of course it was. In January 1903, the Texas company drilled its Fee No. 3 well at Sour Lake and struck oil so hard it flowed 5,000 barrels a day in a single downpour. That company would become Texaco. Within months, the peaceful resort town exploded into a tent city of roughly 10,000 oil workers and 52 saloons. 52! In a town that used to sell bottled healing water to invalids. Derricks went up where bathhouses used to stand, and here's the detail almost nobody mentions when they tell the Texaco origin story. All that pumping caused the ground itself to subside. The mineral springs that had drawn pilgrims for half a century simply sank and disappeared. Nobody drained the lake on purpose. The oil rig just quietly ate the miracle it was standing on. Sour Lake still produces oil today, one of the oldest continuously producing oil fields on the planet. But the lake itself, the one Sam Houston soaked his wounds in, gone. Not changed, gone. There's no plaque marking where it used to be. There's just a small town, a working oil field, and a name on the map that no longer describes anything you can actually find there. Number 9. Thurber. Drive west on Interstate 20 between Fort Worth and Abilene, and you'll see it before you understand what you're looking at. A lone brick smokestack rising 128 feet out of empty pasture land, visible for miles in every direction. That smokestack is nearly all that's left of a town that once had more people living in it than Abilene did. In 1888, the Texas and Pacific Coal Company bought the mineral rights to this stretch of Erath County and did something almost no other town in Texas ever did. They built the entire settlement from scratch, then fenced it. Every building, every house, every saloon, every one of the 200 rooms in the company hotel belonged to the company. Workers were paid in scrip that could only be spent at company stores. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter to keep out labor organizers and unauthorized visitors. At its peak around 1920, Thurber held between 8,000 and 10,000 residents, drawn from at least 18 different nationalities, with large communities of Italian and Polish miners living on segregated sides of a single hill, split down the middle by railroad tracks. This was, briefly, the largest bituminous coal town in Texas, and after a hard-fought unionization battle in 1903, it became the first completely closed-shop union town in the entire country. Then locomotives switched from coal to oil. Demand collapsed through the 1920s. And on one morning in 1933, the company simply announced the town was finished. Not gradually, all at once. The utility poles came down. The wire was salvaged and sold. Houses were dismantled board by board and hauled away, sold for scrap alongside the water pipes and the railroad tracks. A town that had been built all at once, populated all at once, and had thrived all at once, died the exact same way. Today, the official population sits at around 5 people. There's a restaurant in one of the last original brick buildings, and there's a cemetery holding over 1,000 graves of the men and families who lived and worked under a company that owned every square inch of their lives. And there's that smokestack, still standing, still visible from the highway, still marking the exact center of a city the map no longer remembers. Number 8. The Killough settlement near modern Jacksonville. On Christmas Eve of 1837, Isaac Killough Sr. brought his extended family from Alabama to a stretch of land 7 miles northwest of what is now Jacksonville. 4 sons, 2 daughters and their husbands, 2 unrelated single men, roughly 30 people in total, cleared the land, built houses, and planted their first crop. What they didn't fully grasp was that this same land had been formally promised to the Cherokee Nation under a treaty signed by Sam Houston just 1 year earlier, a treaty the Republic of Texas Senate refused to honor and formally nullified. By the summer of 1838, tensions in the region were boiling. Rumors spread of an uprising being organized by Vicente Cordova, a former Nacogdoches official working with Mexican forces to incite native tribes against English-speaking settlers. Frightened, the Killough group fled to Nacogdoches for safety. But their crops were still standing in the field, so eventually they returned to harvest them, reportedly under an informal understanding that they'd be allowed safe passage until, as the old phrase went, the first great white frost. On the afternoon of October 5th, 1838, a band of attackers descended on the settlement while the family worked their fields. When it was over, 18 people were dead or had simply vanished, carried off into the woods. The survivors, including Killough's wife Ursie carrying a newborn on her back, walked 40 miles through the dark to reach the safety of Fort Lacey, hiding from movement on the trail throughout the night. For generations, the attack was blamed entirely on the Cherokee, and that blame became political ammunition. It gave the Republic's second president, Mirabeau Lamar, the justification he wanted to expel the Cherokee from Texas entirely, a campaign of forced removal and bloody retaliatory raids that followed within a year. Except historians now largely agree the attackers weren't Cherokee at all. Later investigation pointed to a mixed band of Mexican operatives, renegades, and possibly white men disguised as native raiders, all working to provoke exactly the war that followed. A 30-foot stone pyramid built by the Work Projects Administration in the late 1930s marks the burial site today, deep in the woods outside Jacksonville, reachable only by a county road that dead ends at the tree line. And to this day, nobody has ever determined what happened to the women and children who were carried off that afternoon. They were never found. They were never identified. They simply disappeared from history, and the monument standing over their family's grave still can't tell you where they went. There's one more layer to this that makes the whole site sit differently once you know it. The historical marker installed at the location in 1965 still tells the old version of events, laying the blame squarely on the Cherokee. Descendants of the Killough family maintain the site to this day and gather there every June for a reunion, standing on ground where their ancestors were killed by attackers whose true identity was likely covered up on purpose to manufacture a war nobody involved that day ever actually chose. Here's the part that makes Killough different from everything else on this list. There is no town here to warn you away from. No gas station, no diner, no locals leaning on a truck telling you not to go past a certain fence line after dark. Isaac Killough's settlement never got the chance to become a town at all. It got 10 months, then it got a massacre, then it got 188 years of silence, broken only by a family reunion every June and a stone pyramid standing alone at the end of a county road that dead ends in trees. Sometimes the creepiest thing about a place in Texas isn't what's still there, it's that nothing ever got the chance to be. Number 7. Bragg Road outside Saratoga. In the deep pine cover of the Big Thicket in Hardin County, there's an 8-mile stretch of dirt road that runs perfectly straight through some of the densest forest in East Texas. It used to be a railroad bed. In 1902, the Santa Fe line cut through here to haul oil, cattle, and timber between the town of Saratoga and a rail junction called Bragg Station. The rails were pulled up in 1934, but the raised, packed earth underneath made for good dry travel, so the road stayed, and so, according to everyone who has ever driven it after dark, did something else. Locals started reporting a light on this road even while the tracks were still down. A glowing orb, sometimes orange, sometimes white or pale blue, that appears somewhere out in the black trees and either drifts, bobs, or, according to some witnesses, approaches. In the summer of 1960, a local newspaper editor named Archer Fullingim ran front-page stories speculating on what the light could be, and those stories got picked up by papers across the state. Suddenly, people were driving from hours away just to park on the sandy road and wait. The explanations pile up the way they always do. Swamp gas, foxfire from bioluminescent fungus feeding on rotting wood, headlights refracting off a distant highway, though multiple accounts note the light is usually seen while facing away from any road that could produce that reflection. The folklore explanations are darker. A railroad brakeman decapitated in a wreck, forever searching the tracks for his head. A groom whose bride was murdered during their honeymoon at the old Bragg Hotel, still walking the road hunting for her killer. A lost hunter who never found his way out of the thicket. One witness account describes the light approaching to within 20 feet of a stalled car, moving with what he called deliberate, conscious motion, before the engine died on its own. Whatever it is, the Big Thicket Association eventually gave up trying to explain it away, and just designated the road an official scenic drive. You can go looking for it tonight if you want. Just don't be surprised if it comes looking for you first. Number 6. Fort Griffin, known to everyone who actually lived there as the Flat. The military fort itself sat up on a bluff overlooking the Clear Fork of the Brazos River, established in 1867 to protect settlers from Comanche and Kiowa raids. But it's the town that grew up directly below it in the low bottomland that earned Fort Griffin its reputation as one of the single most lawless places in the history of the American frontier. Locals called it simply the Flat, or the Bottom, and by the 1870s it had become a mandatory stop on the Great Western Cattle Trail running from San Antonio up to Dodge City, which meant a rotating cast of cowboys, buffalo hunters, and gamblers flowing through its saloons and dance halls at all hours. The guest list here reads like a who's who of Old West violence. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday reportedly first met each other in Fort Griffin. Bat Masterson passed through. So did Pat Garrett, years before he became famous for killing Billy the Kid. Big Nose Kate ran with Holliday here. A gambler known as the Poker Queen, Lottie Dino, made her name at the tables, and running the town's actual law enforcement in an arrangement that tells you everything about how thin the line was a man named John Larn, sheriff by day, cattle rustler, and vigilante executioner by night. His deputy was John Selman, who would go on decades later to shoot the outlaw John Wesley Hardin in the back of the head at a saloon in El Paso. Texas, it turns out, ran out of famous gunfighters faster than it ran out of towns for them to shoot each other in. Larn's own corruption finally caught up with him. The vigilante committees he'd once led turned on him. He was shot to death inside his own jail cell by masked men, a killing nobody was ever charged for. Fort Griffin's idea of due process. In just a 3-month stretch during this period, vigilante justice claimed at least 8 more suspected criminals, executed without trial. Contemporary writers had a name for what the town had become: Babylon on the Brazos. When the buffalo herds were hunted to collapse and the railroad bypassed the town in favor of nearby Albany, Fort Griffin died fast. Today, it's a quiet state historic site with a herd of Texas longhorns grazing where gunfights once erupted nightly, and a visitor center that will happily walk you through exactly how many of its most famous residents ended up killing each other. Number 5. The Shrine of Don Pedrito, Falfurrias. On a stretch of farmland outside the small ranching town of Falfurrias in Brooks County sits a shrine that receives visitors from as far away as New York City, and has for over a century. It marks the burial site of Don Pedro Jaramillo, a curandero or folk healer who arrived at the Los Olmos ranch here in the late 1800s after emigrating from Guadalajara. According to the story that's been passed down through generations of families in South Texas, Jaramillo suffered from a severe nose ailment and, in desperation, treated it himself by daubing mud at the edge of a pool on the property for 3 straight nights. The ailment cleared, but it left him with a permanent scar across his nose, and on that 3rd night, he said he heard a voice tell him God had granted him the power to heal others. Word spread through the ranching communities of South Texas fast. Families with paralysis, chronic illness, and conditions no doctor could touch made the journey to Los Olmos to see him. His treatments were often strange by any conventional medical standard, frequently built around the number 9. 9 nights of a particular herb, 9 glasses of water taken at specific times. Believers say that those who followed his instructions exactly recovered completely, and those who altered so much as a single detail of the prescription did not. Jaramillo died in 1907, but his following never stopped growing. There's now a permanent shrine at his gravesite on FM Highway 1418, along with a Texas state historical marker dedicated in 1971, the first historical marker in the entire state written in both English and Spanish. Letters still arrive at the shrine today, tucked among candles and photographs, addressed directly to a man who's been dead for over a century, asking him to intervene in a job search, a failing marriage, a diagnosis nobody else could explain. Ask around town and people won't tell you to stay away from the shrine. They'll tell you the opposite. They'll tell you to bring water, follow the number 9 exactly, and not to laugh. Because plenty of skeptics who came here just to gawk went home converts. What makes Falfurrias worth including here isn't a ghost story. It's the fact that an entire religious tradition, built entirely around unofficial, undocumented faith healing on a South Texas cattle ranch, has survived for well over 100 years in a small town most people driving Highway 281 have never even slowed down for. Visit the shrine on any given weekend and you'll find pilgrims kneeling in the dirt beside strangers, lighting candles for people they've never met in front of a grave belonging to a man the state of Texas once threatened to jail for practicing medicine without a license. The state that once tried to shut him down is now the same state that put up the historical marker honoring him. Texas, unbeatable at holding a grudge, occasionally beatable by a dead curandero. Number 4, San Elizario. This small community just southeast of El Paso doesn't look dangerous today. Adobe walls, a historic chapel, a quiet plaza. But in December of 1877, San Elizario was the site of the only recorded defeat the Texas Rangers have ever suffered, and it started, of all things, over salt. For generations, Tejano and Mexican residents on both sides of the Rio Grande had harvested salt freely from massive natural deposits near the Guadalupe Mountains, a right they considered guaranteed under old Spanish land grants. In 1877, a former district judge named Charles Howard filed a legal claim to those salt beds in his father-in-law's name and began charging fees to gather what had always been free. The backlash was immediate. When Howard had 2 local men arrested for defying his claim, a furious crowd seized him and held him prisoner for 3 days inside San Elizario before releasing him on the condition he renounce the claim and leave the region for good. He didn't keep his word. Instead, Howard tracked down and shot dead his former ally turned rival Louis Cardis in an El Paso store. Then, astonishingly, he came right back to San Elizario in December, this time with 20 newly recruited Texas Rangers under Lieutenant John Taze, to press trespassing charges against the very people he'd wronged. Bold move. The town rose up. For 5 days, an armed mob laid siege to the building where Howard and his Rangers had taken shelter. On the 5th day, with food and water gone, Howard surrendered himself to spare his men. He was executed by firing squad along with 2 associates. The Rangers, believing they'd be released unharmed, surrendered their weapons and were allowed to walk away. That's it. That's the only time in the history of the Texas Rangers the unit has ever formally given up. It didn't end there. In the chaotic days that followed, detachments of troops and armed posses descended on San Elizario, and an untold number of Tejano and Mexican residents were killed, robbed, or driven from their homes, with no one ever arrested or brought to trial for any of it. San Elizario lost its status as county seat shortly after, permanently overtaken by the growing city of El Paso. The chapel where Howard and his men barricaded themselves is still standing, still an active parish today, quietly holding the memory of the one fight the Rangers never won, over a resource that by weight is worth less than the bullets it took to fight over it. Number 3, Uncertain, Texas. Even the name of this place admits it doesn't fully know what it is. Uncertain sits on the western edge of Caddo Lake, a 25,000-acre swamp of towering bald cypress trees, some of them over 400 years old, draped floor to canopy in Spanish moss along the Texas-Louisiana border. Nobody agrees on how the town got its name. One story says early settlers filling out a township application simply wrote uncertain in the blank where a name was supposed to go, because they hadn't picked one yet. Another says it comes from the fact that the border between Texas and the old Republic of Texas once ran directly through this stretch of swamp, leaving residents literally uncertain which nation they belonged to. Even the lake's origin is disputed. Caddo legend holds it was formed by an earthquake around 1811 after a chief disobeyed the Great Spirit. Geologists say it was actually created by a massive natural logjam on the Red River known as the Great Raft, which backed water up into this basin over the course of centuries. What isn't disputed is the swamp itself, which is reason enough to put this place on the list even before you get to the history. Bald cypress trees older than the Republic of Texas rise straight out of black water, their trunks flared and knuckled with knees that break the surface like something surfacing for air. Spanish moss hangs off every branch in sheets thick enough to blot out the sky. Fog sits on the water most mornings and doesn't lift until noon. It is, by any measure, one of the most photogenic places in North America, and it looks exactly like what you'd design if someone asked you to build a haunted swamp from scratch. Then there's what actually happened here in 1869. The steamer Mitty Stevens caught fire on Caddo Lake at night, and roughly 60 passengers burned to death. Not because the fire was unsurvivable, but because in the dark and the smoke, nobody realized how close the shore actually was, or how shallow the water beneath them sat. 60 people died within swimming distance of dry land and never knew it. That's the version of Caddo Lake nobody photographs for Instagram. Today, Uncertain has fewer than 100 full-time residents, and the cypress swamp around it draws paddlers and photographers from around the world. It has also, for reasons locals will happily explain to you over a beer, become one of the most consistently reported sighting locations for the Texas version of Bigfoot, with hundreds of residents over the decades claiming encounters in the deep cypress cover. Whether you believe that part or not, standing in the middle of Caddo Lake at dusk, watching 2 centuries of moss-draped trees fold into fog on water that once swallowed 60 people in a single night, you start to understand exactly why nobody here has ever felt the need to give this place a more certain name. Number 2. Indianola. At its peak in the 1870s, Indianola had more than 5,000 residents and was the second largest port in the state of Texas. A booming deep-water harbor on Matagorda Bay that historians now say might have grown into a city the size of Houston if history had gone even slightly differently. German, Polish, and Czech immigrants poured through its docks by the thousands. It was the entry point for the U.S. Army's genuinely bizarre experiment importing camels for desert transport in the 1850s. In 1869, it became the launch site for the world's first shipment of mechanically refrigerated beef. Then, on September 15, 1875, a hurricane made landfall directly over the town. Winds estimated between 110 and 145 miles per hour tore through Indianola while it was packed with extra visitors attending a high-profile murder trial. When the storm cleared 2 days later, only 8 buildings in the entire town remained undamaged. Death toll estimates range as high as 400 people. Survivors rebuilt, smaller and more cautious this time. It didn't matter. On August 19, 1886, a second hurricane, this one even more violent, slammed into the same stretch of coastline, this time bringing a wall of fire with it as the storm knocked out gas lines and ignited what was left of the town. A storm surge estimated at 15 feet carried boats up to 5 miles inland. Only 2 buildings were left standing. The post office closed for good the following year. The town was never rebuilt a second time. What's left of Indianola today mostly sits underwater, submerged beneath the shallow, quiet waters of Matagorda Bay. At low tide, remnants of the old town are occasionally still visible beneath the surface. A statue of the French explorer La Salle stands near the shoreline, along with a single fragment of the old courthouse, engraved with a message that reads, in part, that within its walls, precious lives were saved during the storms of 1875 and 1886. What the marker doesn't say is that the town that saved those few lives no longer exists in any form you could walk through. Indianola isn't a ghost town in the traditional sense, with empty buildings standing abandoned in the wind. It's simply gone, dissolved into the bay it once shipped cargo across, visible now only as a shadow beneath the waterline on a calm day. Number 1. Grange, and the hill above it. Grange looks like any other quiet Fayette County river town. Antique shops, a courthouse square, a slow bend of the Colorado River running past it. But on a sandstone bluff just south of downtown, there's a granite crypt containing the remains of men whose deaths were decided, quite literally, by the drawing of a bean out of a clay jar. In November of 1842, a group of roughly 300 Texian soldiers marched south across the Rio Grande into the Mexican town of Ciudad Mier, part of a retaliatory raid following an earlier attack known as the Dawson Massacre, in which 36 Texas militiamen had been killed near San Antonio. The raid on Mier went badly. The Texians were overwhelmed by a much larger Mexican force and surrendered, roughly 250 men taken prisoner, and marched south toward Mexico City. Within 6 weeks, 181 of them managed to escape their captors. It should have been a triumph. Instead, brutal desert conditions with almost no water forced 176 of the escapees to surrender again within days, exhausted and starving. This is when Santa Anna, furious at the escape attempt, issued an order that 1 in every 10 recaptured men would be executed. On March 25, 1843, Mexican Colonel Domingo Huerta filled an earthen jar with 159 white beans and 17 black beans. The prisoners were lined up in alphabetical order and, one at a time, blindfolded, reached into the jar. White meant you lived. Black meant you would be shot within hours. The very first man to draw was Major James Decatur Cock, and according to a witness who survived to tell the story, Cock held the black bean up between his fingers, smiled with what was described as open contempt, and said simply that he'd never once failed to draw a prize in his life. 16 more men drew black beans after him. One of them, James Shepard, survived the firing squad by feigning death and lay motionless among the bodies until nightfall, only to be recaptured and executed separately when guards discovered he was still alive. The 17 executed men were shot in the head and face, and several Mexican officers forced to witness the killings reportedly wept openly during the executions. For 5 years, the remains of these men stayed in Mexican soil, until a survivor named Captain John Dusenberry made the journey back in 1847 specifically to exhume his former comrades. He carried their bones by ship to Galveston, then by wagon to Grange, where he chose to bury them here because it was the hometown of Captain William Eastland, the only officer among the 17 executed. Citizens of Fayette County simultaneously dug up the remains of the Dawson Massacre victims from a separate grave near San Antonio and brought them here as well. On September 14, 1848, in a ceremony attended by roughly 1,000 people, both groups were laid together in a single common tomb on this bluff overlooking the town. A granite vault now encloses the original grave, and the hillside itself carries the name Monument Hill. Stand on that bluff today, and you're looking out over a peaceful river bend. Tourists wandering an antique district, families having picnics on the very ground where a jar of beans once decided man by man exactly who would go home and who wouldn't. 17 names are carved into that monument. Every one of them knew, in the exact second their fingers closed around a bean inside that jar, whether they had just been given the rest of their life or the last few hours of it. There's a strange kind of quiet that settles over Monument Hill that doesn't show up anywhere else on this list. It isn't a haunted road or a swamp full of cryptid sightings or a submerged city you can only imagine from old photographs. It's a granite box holding the bones of men who found out their fate through pure chance, blindfolded, one bean at a time, while officers who were ordered to shoot them stood there and wept doing it. Every other place on this list took its victims through storms, fire, greed, or violence that unfolded over hours or years. This one took 17 lives in the space it takes to reach into a jar. These 10 places are still standing, or in Indianola's case, still submerged. Right now, tonight, while you're watching this, the light is still out there on Bragg Road for anyone willing to sit in the dark and wait for it to notice you first. Like this video if any of these kept you up a little later than you planned, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next list of Texas the postcards forgot to mention.